Daniel was not famous or rich, but he had one big dream: to stand on the icy land of Antarctica. Since he was a boy, he loved maps and circled the frozen continent with a red pen. He read books about explorers who crossed the snow, watched documentaries with wide eyes, and imagined the wind on his face. But Daniel had never seen snow. He lived in a quiet city and worked in a small museum where he helped children learn about nature. Every night, he opened his notebook and wrote ideas. What will I wear? Will I see penguins? How cold is -40? He didn't know the answers yet, but he kept whispering to himself, one day, I will go. One cold morning in October, Daniel received a letter that made his hands shake. It came from a research team planning a trip to Antarctica. They were looking for someone to join them. Someone curious, careful, and brave. The letter said, "We believe your passion for nature makes you a perfect fit." Daniel read it 3 times. His heart raced. Was this real? Could this be his chance? He had no experience in polar travel, but he had years of studying, dreaming, and planning. For a moment, he stood still, staring out the window at the city below. Then he smiled and said quietly, "This is it. My journey is beginning." Before leaving, Daniel wanted to speak with someone who had walked on the ice. He searched for days until he found an old man named Mr. Hahn, a retired explorer who had visited Antarctica many years ago. Mr. Hahn lived in a small house filled with books, photos, and snow boots that looked older than Daniel himself. They sat together by a heater, and Mr. Hahn told stories of white silence, frozen winds, and nights under a sky full of stars. He warned Daniel, "The cold is not just outside. It can live in your thoughts too. But if you listen to the ice, it will teach you more than any book." Before Daniel left, Mr. Hahn handed him a thick pair of gloves and said, "These saved my fingers. Now they're yours." 2 weeks later, Daniel boarded a plane heading south, as far south as planes could fly. He wore a heavy coat, thick boots, and carried a backpack full of notes and hope. After a long journey through clouds and over oceans, he arrived at the edge of Antarctica. The cold hit him like a wall, sharp and powerful, but the view stole his breath. Endless snow stretched in every direction, glowing under a pale blue sky. Mountains of ice rose in the distance, and a group of penguins waddled past the camp as if they owned the land. Daniel touched the snow with his gloved hand and whispered, "I'm really here." That night, as he lay in a small tent, under the wind's lonely song, he couldn't sleep. Not from fear, but from wonder. The days that followed were not easy. Daniel woke up early to help carry equipment, set up weather stations, and record notes for the research team. The cold was like a shadow that never left, biting through layers of clothes and turning breath into white clouds. One morning, a sudden storm arrived without warning. The wind screamed across the ice, shaking the tents and covering the path in snow. Daniel's boots froze solid, and his hands went numb as he tried to dig out tools buried beneath the ice. Another day, he got separated from the group while collecting samples near a ridge. For 15 minutes, he felt the fear of being lost in a place where everything looked the same. But he stayed calm, followed his footprints, and found his way back. Through each test, he learned to respect the ice, read the sky, and trust his instincts. After 2 weeks of hard work and cold winds, the team prepared for their biggest challenge, a long journey to a glacier that had never been explored on foot. It was deep in the south, far from any base, and reaching it would take 3 days of walking across uneven ice. The team checked their gear, packed food, and studied satellite maps. Daniel felt nervous, but excited. This was the kind of mission he had dreamed about for years. Each night before the trip, he trained by pulling a sled and walking in snowshoes until his legs ached. He listened to the team leader, asked questions, and learned how to find direction using the sun and wind. On the morning of departure, the sky was clear, and the sun painted the snow in soft gold. As they stepped into the unknown, Daniel whispered to himself, "This is the real beginning." On the second day of the journey, trouble came without warning. As the team crossed a flat white plain, the ice suddenly cracked beneath them. A deep crevasse, hidden by a thin layer of snow, opened just a few steps ahead. Everyone froze. One wrong move could mean disaster. The team stopped and quickly checked the ground. The path they had planned was now too dangerous. Tired, cold, and unsure, some team members suggested turning back. But Daniel stepped forward, pointing to a safer-looking ridge on the map. "We can go this way," he said. It was a longer route, but it avoided the dangerous ice. The team agreed, and Daniel led the way. The snow was deeper and the wind stronger, but no one fell. That night, they camped under a quiet sky, and the leader looked at Daniel and said, "Good thinking. You may have saved the day." On the third morning, after hours of slow walking and careful steps, the team reached the glacier. It rose like a frozen wave in the middle of nowhere, blue, wide, and shining under the morning sun. No human had ever stood there before. The team cheered quietly, their voices soft in the icy air. Daniel stepped forward and placed one hand on the cold surface. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. It felt like touching time itself. The ice was thousands of years old, holding secrets of weather, water, and life. They set up equipment, took photos, and collected ice samples for study. But for Daniel, the real treasure was not in the tools or the data. It was the moment itself. The silence, the beauty, the feeling of doing something that mattered. He smiled and whispered, "This was worth every step." The team spent one final day at the glacier, finishing their research and watching the sunlight dance across the ice. Then they packed their gear and began the long journey back. Daniel felt different. His body was tired, but his heart was full. The wind no longer felt scary. The silence now felt like a friend. When they returned to base camp, the team celebrated with hot tea and warm food. Daniel wrote notes in his journal and drew a small map of their path. He looked at the ice one last time before boarding the plane home. He didn't cry, but something in him had changed. He had faced storms, walked through fear, and stood in a place no one had been before. And now, he was going home with more than photos. He was going home with a story. Back in his city, everything looked smaller. The streets, the buildings, even the sky. Daniel returned to his job at the museum, but now he was no longer just someone who read books about Antarctica. He was someone who had been there. He brought samples to the museum, shared photos with students, and told stories to curious visitors. Children gathered around him and asked questions like, "Did you see a real penguin? And is it true the sun never sets in summer?" Daniel answered each one with a smile. His voice was calm, but his eyes carried the wind and light of Antarctica. He wanted people to understand that nature was not just something far away. It was something we could protect, respect, and learn from. Daniel's life slowly changed. He started writing a book called The Last Step, sharing not just facts but feelings. The fear of the storm, the silence of the ice, the beauty of untouched snow. Schools invited him to speak. People who had never thought about Antarctica began to listen. He joined groups that worked to protect the environment and spoke about how even one person can make a difference. He still lived in the same small apartment, drank the same morning tea, and walked the same streets. But inside, he had grown. He no longer saw the world as something distant and cold. He saw it as something full of wonder, waiting to be explored. One evening, Daniel sat alone in his room. On the wall was a photo of the glacier, the one he had touched, the one no one else had reached before. The light in the photo was soft, and the ice looked like frozen waves under the sun. He stared at it for a long time, then closed his eyes. He remembered the sound of his boots in the snow, the wind on his face, and the feeling of standing in a place that had waited for thousands of years. He smiled quietly and whispered, "The cold taught me more than any school ever did." Outside, the city lights glowed, but inside his heart, the ice still whispered, and he was still listening.